The morning Jennie Wells's barn roof caved in under 3 days of relentless rain. She stood in the mud with her jaw set hard and her fists clenched at her sides, and she told herself she did not need a single soul on this earth to help her fix it. The year was 1882, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat right on the edge of the Kishom Trail like a knot on a rope, wild and necessary, and always on the verge of coming undone. Cattle drives still thundered through twice a year, churning the main street into a river of red dust and noise, and the saloons stayed lit until dawn while the respectable folk shuttered their windows and pretended they did not hear the laughter and the gunshots. Jennie Wells was neither a saloon woman nor the kind of respectable that required shuttered windows. She was something rarer and harder to categorize. She was a woman alone on 40 acres of decent grazing land, running a small but honest cattle operation that her late husband, Robert Wells, had left her 3 years prior when a fever took him in October of 1879. Robert had been a good man. Not a great one, perhaps, but steady and kind. And he had believed in Jennie's ability to manage things in a way that most men of the time did not believe in their wives. He had told her in his last lucid days that the land was hers and she should never let anyone take it from her. Not the bank, not the neighbors, not the town, not anyone. She had taken those words and pressed them into her chest like a brand, and she had run that ranch with a determination so fierce it sometimes frightened even her. She had a hand named Cleo, a black man of about 50 who had been working with Robert since before the war, and who had chosen to stay on after emancipation because he had nowhere better to go, and because the Wells land was the closest thing to his own he had ever known. Jennie paid him fair wages, a fact that was remarked upon by the town with a mixture of disapproval and grudging respect. She also had a young Mexican boy of about 16 named Tomás who handled the horses and the mending, and seemed to be everywhere at once without ever appearing rushed. And now, with the barn roof collapsed inward like a broken rib cage, she was staring at the wreckage and calculating in her head what it would cost her and how long it would take, and whether she could afford the lumber before winter arrived and made everything impossible. "Jennie," Cleo said from beside her, his voice careful in the way it always was when he thought she was about to do something unwise, "that roof ain't something 2 people can fix in a season. You're going to need more hands." "We'll manage," she said. "The cattle need shelter before October, you know that." "I know that, Cleo. So then you know we need help." "We'll manage," she said again, and that was the end of the conversation because when Jennie Wells said something twice, she meant it down to the marrow. She drove the wagon into Caldwell that afternoon to price lumber at Hartley's General Supply. The road from her ranch to town was 4 miles of rutted earth that wound past 2 other homesteads and then opened onto the wide grid of Caldwell's Main Street, which was still muddy from the rains. She tied the wagon horse to the post outside Hartley's and went in with her list written on a folded piece of paper, and she handed it to old Marcus Hartley and waited while he ran his pencil down the figures. He looked up at her over the rim of his spectacles. "That's going to be about $42, Mrs. Wells." She had 31 in the strongbox at home and $8 in her coat pocket. "I'll need to put some of it on credit." Marcus Hartley's expression shifted in a way she did not like. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Wells. Your account is already carrying a balance from the spring. I can't extend further without some collateral arrangement." She held very still. "I see. If you had a man to co-sign." "Thank you, Mr. Hartley," she said, and she folded the paper back into her pocket and walked out of the store with her spine straight as a fence post, and her face arranged into perfect composure, and she did not let the breath out until she was standing on the sidewalk boards where no one could see her eyes. It was there, in that moment of controlled breathing and absolute refusal to cry, that she first properly noticed Louis Whitaker. She had seen him before, in the way you see anyone who passes through a town often enough. He was a trail hand who had recently taken a job with the Dawson outfit, which ran cattle on the eastern edge of Caldwell and was known as one of the more reliable operations in the area. Louis was 28 years old, tall and broad across the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly where it touched the back of his collar and a face that was weathered from years of outdoor work but still held something open in it, something that had not yet been closed off by the hardness of the trail. He had gray eyes that people tended to remember after meeting him, not because they were cold, but because they were the opposite of cold. They noticed things. They noticed the way a horse was favoring its left foreleg, or the way a cloud formation promised weather, or the way a woman was standing on a sidewalk with her jaw set and her fists at her sides trying very hard not to fall apart. He was coming out of the barber shop across the street when he saw her, and he stopped walking. He had heard about Jennie Wells the way everyone in Caldwell had heard about her, in pieces and fragments passed around the way gossip always moved in a small town. The widow on the Mesa Road with the cattle operation, too stubborn to remarry, too proud to ask for help. They said it like it was a flaw. Louis had always thought when he heard it that it sounded more like a particular kind of courage that people who had never needed it couldn't understand. He crossed the street. "Mrs. Wells," he said, touching the brim of his hat. She looked at him with eyes that were dry and composed and gave nothing away. "Mr. Whitaker, you look like a woman who's just been told something she didn't want to hear." "That's not your concern," she said pleasantly, in a tone that was not pleasant at all. "No," he agreed. "It's not." He stood there for a moment, and the silence between them had a texture to it, something almost combative. "Heard your barn roof came down. Word travels fast. Small town." He tilted his head slightly. "I've got some experience with construction, frame buildings, that kind of thing. My father built houses before the war." She looked at him steadily. "I'm sure he did. I could take a look at what you're dealing with." "I didn't ask for a look at anything." "No," he said, "you didn't." And then, without any particular ceremony, he said, "I'll come by tomorrow morning with some tools." And he turned and walked back across the street toward the livery. And Jennie Wells stood on the sidewalk and stared after him with an expression that mixed fury and astonishment in roughly equal parts. She drove home telling herself she would not answer the door when he came. She answered the door at 7 in the morning when the knock came, because she was already awake and dressed and standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, and telling herself she would not answer it was one thing while actually not answering it was another thing entirely. She opened the door and Louis Whitaker was standing on her porch with a toolbox in one hand and what appeared to be a carefully considered expression on his face, one that was not smug and not overly friendly but simply present, as if he had shown up to do a job and expected to do it. Behind him, on the road, there was a wagon loaded with lumber. She stared at the wagon, then at him. "I arranged credit with Hartley on your behalf," he said before she could speak. "You can pay me back at whatever rate suits you. There's no hurry." The fury that moved through her was so complete and so immediate that it actually steadied her, the way a very cold plunge of water can steady the nerves. "You did what?" "The lumber was the first problem. Figured I'd solve that one before I got to the rest." "I did not give you permission to do that." "No," he said, "you didn't." She wanted to slam the door. She wanted to be the kind of woman who could simply slam the door in the face of a well-intentioned man and feel righteous about it. But the lumber was sitting there on the wagon and the barn roof was a skeleton of broken beams behind her house, and October was coming. She took a long breath through her nose. "You'll be paid back in full before winter," she said. "I know I will. Don't act like you know anything about me, Mr. Whitaker." "I know enough," he said, and there was nothing in his tone except quiet certainty, and somehow that was more irritating than arrogance would have been. She stepped back from the door. "Come in for coffee before you start. It's the least I can do." He came in, and he sat at her kitchen table without looking around as if he were cataloging her possessions or judging the state of the room, and she set a cup in front of him and sat across from him, and they drank coffee together in silence for a few minutes while the morning light came through the window and lay itself across the table in pale yellow bars. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally. He turned the cup in his hands once. Because it needed doing. That's not a reason. It's the only one I've got right now that makes any sense, he said, and he looked at her with those gray eyes that notice things, and she looked back, and something passed between them that she was not prepared to name and immediately decided not to think about. My hands will help, she said. Cleo knows construction. Tamaz is quick with instructions. Good, I'll need the help. They went out to look at the barn together, and Louis walked through the debris with his hands in his pockets, and his eyes moving over every beam and post, and he asked questions in a practical and direct way that she found herself responding to with the same practicality and directness. And within an hour they had a plan, a real plan, with materials allocated and a timeline that could actually work. Cleo watched Louis from a careful distance that morning, the way a man watches someone he has not yet decided about. By noon, after Louis had worked alongside him without commentary or condescension, and had asked his opinion on the framing as if the opinion genuinely mattered, Cleo's expression shifted into something closer to acceptance. By the end of the day, they were talking over the work in the easy way of men who respect each other's competence. Jennie noticed this. She noticed most things. She brought lunch out to the three of them at midday, cold biscuits and dried beef and a jug of water, and they sat in the shade of the old water trough and ate. And Louis told a story about a construction job in Wichita that had gone sideways because the foreman had ordered the ridge beam cut 2 inches short, and then refused to admit his error for 3 days while the whole crew waited, and Cleo laughed with genuine surprise at the ending, and Tamaz grinned broadly. And Jennie found herself smiling before she could stop it. Louis caught the smile. He did not remark on it. He looked away with what she would later realize was deliberate tact, and she was grateful for it, though she would not have said so. He came back the next day, and the day after that. He was working at the Dawson place on alternating days, and he rearranged his schedule in ways she did not know about and was not told because he knew she would object. He simply appeared each morning with the tools, and sometimes with additional materials he had sourced or negotiated. And he worked hard and without complaint, and he was easy to be around in a way that surprised her because she had been expecting difficulty. She had expected him to require something of her, the kind of attention and appreciation that some men demanded when they performed charity. He didn't. He just worked. He accepted the meals she made because to refuse them would have been rude, and he talked when there was something worth saying and was quiet when there wasn't. And somewhere in the second week of this arrangement, Jennie realized that she had stopped counting the hours until he left and had started, without any conscious decision about it, looking forward to the sound of his wagon on the road in the mornings. That realization disturbed her considerably. She was not a woman who fell into things. She had married Robert Wells at 22 after a proper courtship of 14 months, and she had loved him in a measured and reliable way, the way you love something that belongs to your life in a fundamental sense. She was 27 now, and she had spent 3 years not thinking about the kind of love that wasn't measured and reliable, because there was no room in a working ranch for that kind of distraction, and because she was afraid of what it might cost her, not in reputation or propriety, but in the deeper currency of selfhood that she had worked so hard to accumulate. The barn took 4 weeks to rebuild. In that time, she learned the following things about Louis Whitaker. He had grown up in Missouri, the second son of a builder who had moved his family west after the war looking for work. He had spent his late teens on the cattle drives, starting as a wrangler and working up through the ranks, and had ended up in Kansas because the Kishom Trail ended in Kansas, and he had never gotten around to leaving. He read when he could, mostly history and occasionally novels that he borrowed from the lending shelf at the general store, which he returned promptly. He had strong opinions about the treatment of horses and absolutely no patience for men who used spurs carelessly or rode with a heavy hand. He was honest about money in a way that was almost startling for the time, keeping careful account of what he spent on her behalf and presenting her with a clear ledger without being asked. He learned things about her too. He learned that she had grown up in Missouri as well, though they had never crossed paths there, a coincidence that seemed to amuse them both in different ways. He learned that she had come to Kansas at 19 when Robert Wells had brought her west, and that she had hated Kansas for the first year with a passion she was not proud of in retrospect, and that she had then, incrementally and against her better judgment, fallen in love with the land itself. He learned that she had a sister in St. Louis who wrote twice a year, and always included a gentle suggestion that Jennie come back east and find a more suitable life, and that these letters arrived with regularity and were answered with a politeness that conveyed nothing of the reality of Jennie's actual feelings. He learned that she was capable of stubbornness, so profound it could have geological applications, and also that she was capable of a generosity so instinctive and complete that it appeared before her pride could intervene. The day the barn was finished, they all stood looking at it. It was a solid structure, squarer and stronger than the original, and the new boards still gleamed with their raw wood color in the afternoon light. Cleo put his hands on his hips and nodded slowly, the way a man nods when a thing has been done right. Tamaz ran his hand along one of the outer beams with an expression of uncomplicated pride. Jennie stood with her arms crossed and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized was tight. "It's good work," she said, to all of them and to none of them in particular. "Better than the old one," Cleo said. Louis was standing a little apart from the others, cleaning a chisel on the edge of his work cloth. He said nothing, which was somehow the most appropriate thing he could have done. "Mr. Whitaker," Jennie said. He looked over. "I want to settle the account." He shook his head slightly. "When you're ready, there's no rush. I don't like having debts hanging." "I know." He began packing the tools into the box with the economical movements of someone who has done something thousands of times. "But the timber doesn't expire and neither does the debt. Settle it when the cattle come through next season." She watched him. There was something in the way he managed this, the money, the help, all of it, that was different from any arrangement she had experienced before. It did not feel like charity. It did not feel like a transaction. It felt like something she didn't have a word for yet, which was the problem. "At least stay for supper," she said. He looked up from the toolbox. The light had turned golden the way it did in late afternoon in Kansas, long and horizontal and almost amber, and it caught the angles of his face and made him look, just for a moment, less weathered and more something else, something younger and more uncertain, which was closer to what he actually was. "I'd like that," he said. She made beef stew and corn bread, which were things she could make well, and they sat at the kitchen table, all four of them, Jennie and Louis and Cleo and Tamaz, and ate with the comfortable noise of people who have worked alongside each other and are not required to perform anything. After supper, Cleo and Tamaz went to the bunkhouse, and Jennie poured 2 cups of coffee, and she and Louis sat on the porch in the cooling evening and watched the sky turn color. "You don't have to keep coming around," she said. The barn was done. The stated reason for his presence had reached its natural conclusion. "I know I don't," he said. The darkness settled in slowly, the way it does in open country where there is no wall to cast a sharp shadow, and the stars appeared one by one and then all at once. "My husband built this porch," she said, not knowing exactly why she said it. Louis nodded. He did not say anything about Robert Wells, which was the correct response, because there was nothing to say that would not feel like either an imposition or an avoidance. "He would have liked the barn," she said. "He always wanted to rebuild it properly but never quite had the funds." She paused. "He'd have liked you, I think. He respected men who were competent and didn't require praise for it." Louis turned the coffee cup in his hands. "That's a fine thing to say." "I'm not saying it to be fine. I'm saying it because it's true." She looked at him sideways. "I notice when things are true, it's one of my better qualities." "What are your worst ones?" She almost smiled. "You've witnessed them daily for 4 weeks." He did smile, and it was the kind of smile that arrived slowly, like weather that builds on the horizon before it arrives, and when it was fully there it changed his whole face. Pride's not a flaw, he said. It's misapplied sometimes, but it's not a flaw. You misapply yours, she said. You pretend you don't have any. He went quiet for a moment, and she could see she had landed something true, had pressed on a spot that had actual depth to it. Maybe, he said. They sat for a while longer, and then he stood and said good night and collected his hat from the peg by the door, and she walked him to the edge of the porch and watched him cross the yard to where his horse was tied at the far post, and he mounted with the ease of someone who has spent half his life on horseback, and he rode off down the road toward town, and the sound of the horse's hooves faded slowly into the dark. She stood on the porch for a while after with her coffee cup held in both hands and the night around her, and she permitted herself to acknowledge, very quietly and with considerable reluctance, that she was in trouble. He came back the following Sunday, which was not a work day, with no stated reason and no tools. He knocked on the door in the mid-morning, and when she answered he said he had been riding and the road went past her place, and he wondered if she wanted to take a look at the west pasture fence line he had noticed needed attention on one of his earlier visits. The fence line, she said. The south post on the third section has some rot at the base. Could be a problem before spring. She looked at him for a long moment. You're a terrible liar, Mr. Whitaker. He had the grace to color slightly at the collar. Is that a no? She got her hat from the hook by the door. Let me get my horse. They rode the fence line on the west pasture, which did in fact have a rotting post, so he had not entirely fabricated the reason. They also rode further than the fence line, out along the edge of the property, where the land rolled slightly before leveling off into the flat grassland of the eastern range, and the morning was cool and bright with a wind from the north that smelled of autumn coming. They rode mostly in comfortable silence, which was something she was not accustomed to with any man except Cleo, the ability to simply be in motion next to someone without the silence requiring management. Tell me about your family, she said at one point. You've mentioned your father. He rode for a few strides before answering. My mother died when I was 12. Fever, same as winters always bring. My father remarried when I was 15, a woman named Agnes who was perfectly fine and had no particular interest in me or my brother. We left when we were old enough. Marcus, my brother, went south. I went west. Do you write to him, your brother? Twice a year. He's in Texas now, has a wife and 2 children, does well with horses. Do you miss him? Another pause. I miss the version of things we were before everything changed. He's a different man now, which is right and proper. We were boys when we last knew each other properly. She understood this in a way that lived below language. My sister and I are like that, she said. We were very close when we were small. She was 2 years younger and we were always together. Then she married early, a man from St. Louis with money, and everything around her became a different life, and we couldn't quite find each other across that distance. Does she know what you're doing out here? Really know it? She knows I have a ranch. She thinks it's a difficulty I should be extracted from. She doesn't understand that it's the most myself I've ever been. He looked over at her as they rode, and the look lasted several seconds, which was longer than a casual look, and she met it and held it, and then they both looked back at the grass ahead of them. You're the most competent person I've met in this county, he said, including every man I've worked with on the trail. She could feel the warmth of the statement moving through her chest. She managed it the way she managed most things that moved through her chest uninvited. That's a practical observation rather than a compliment. It can be both, he said. That evening he stayed for supper again without being asked, and this time Cleo was not at the house because he and Tamaz had gone into town, and she and Louis ate alone at the kitchen table for the first time, and the dynamic was different, quieter and more aware. Not uncomfortable, something else, the kind of awareness that has weight to it. Afterward she washed the dishes and he dried them without asking, and they worked in a silence that was domestic and improbable, and she kept her eyes on the pan in her hands and thought about nothing at all very carefully. Jennie, he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and she went very still. She turned around. He was standing 3 feet away with the drying cloth in his hand and an expression on his face she had not seen before. The openness was there as always, but it was concentrated now, directed, the way light concentrates through glass. "I'd like to court you," he said, "properly, if you're willing." The silence that followed was 5 seconds long, and she counted them because it gave her something to do with her mind while the rest of her managed the information. "I'm not easy to court," she said. "I know that. I don't intend to give up the ranch or defer to anyone on decisions about it. I know that too. And I don't want," she stopped and then started again. "I don't want something that looks like what it's supposed to look like without actually being anything. I had a good marriage. I'm not interested in a lesser version." "Neither am I," he said. She studied him for a very long time. He held still under the study in the way that a man who has nothing to hide holds still, with patience rather than defensiveness. "All right," she said at last. He breathed out. It was a small exhalation, barely perceptible, but she saw it, and she understood that he had been more anxious than he was showing, and that understanding rearranged something inside her. She liked that he had been anxious. She liked that it mattered enough to him to make him anxious. "Sunday," he said. "I'll come by Sunday and take you to the social at the church hall if you'll have it. I haven't been to a church social in 2 years. Time to go back," he said, with that slow smile arriving again. She turned back to the sink. "Sunday, then." The Caldwell Community Social was held in the church hall on the first Sunday of every month from spring through fall, and it was the main organized gathering for the respectable population of the town and its surrounds, which meant it was also the main venue for social observation and commentary. Jennie Wells arriving with Louis Whitaker was going to be noticed. She knew this. She wore her blue dress, which was the best she had, a dark blue wool that she had bought in Wichita 3 years prior and maintained with considerable care. She pinned her hair up with the 2 good ivory pins that had been her mother's. She did not spend more than 10 minutes on any of this, because to spend more would have been to admit a degree of importance to the occasion that she was not entirely comfortable admitting. Louis arrived at exactly the time he said he would, which was not a small thing. She had not forgotten, in 3 years of managing everything alone, what it was like to be able to count on someone for the specific small things. He was wearing a clean dark coat and a white shirt, and he had gotten his hair cut recently. She could tell. And he looked different in the church social context than he looked in work clothes, more formal and slightly stiffer, and she found this endearing in a way she had not expected. He helped her into the wagon with a hand she did not need and accepted without comment. The social was, as she had anticipated, a scene of considerable curiosity. Margaret Howell, who ran the seamstress shop and had appointed herself the informal registry of Caldwell's social movements, appeared at Jennie's elbow within 4 minutes of their arrival, with a face full of avid welcome. Jennie bore her attention with her usual composure. Louis bore it with a courtesy so exact it was almost a form of deflection, answering questions pleasantly and without useful information. "He's good," Margaret Howell said to Jennie when Louis had moved away to speak to someone from the Dawson outfit. She said it with a surprised approval that acknowledged Louis's social navigation. "Don't get ahead of yourself, Margaret," Jennie said pleasantly. But she watched him across the room, and she thought about how he moved through the space, at ease without being careless, attentive without being ingratiating, and she thought about how it had not occurred to her, in all the weeks he had been coming to her property, to question his character. She had questioned his motives. She had questioned her own responses. She had never once questioned whether he was a good man, because the evidence of that had accumulated daily in ways that were impossible to overlook. There was music later, a fiddle player and a woman who played the hammer dulcimer, and when Louis appeared at her elbow and held out his hand, she took it without hesitation, which surprised her more than it surprised him. He danced well, not showily, but competently, and he held her with appropriate propriety and appropriate firmness. And when the music played something slower, he adjusted without comment, and they moved through it together with the easy coordination of two people who have been working alongside each other long enough to know the other's rhythms. "You're not bad at this," she said, because saying nothing felt like too much acknowledgement of what was happening, and saying something false felt worse. "My mother insisted on it," he said. "Before she died, she said a man who couldn't dance at a social was only half civilized. She sounds like she had things right." "She had most things right," he said, and the easy sadness in his voice when he said it was the kind that has been lived with for a long time and has become a dull, steady weight rather than an acute pain. She thought, not for the first time, about the things that shape a person. Her own shaping had been loss and responsibility, and the specific lonely dignity of managing alone. His had been something similar, arrived at differently. They were not the same, but they were not so different that the shape of one couldn't recognize the shape of the other. After the social, he drove her home in the dark, and the night was clear and cold with that first edge of autumn that felt like a warning, and they sat close on the wagon seat because of the cold, which was the honest reason and also not the only reason. He walked her to the door, and she turned on the top step, which put her almost at eye level with him, and they looked at each other in the lantern light from the window. "I had a good time," she said. "So did I." She put her hand briefly against his chest, over the lapel of the dark coat, and felt the warmth of him through the fabric, and then she stepped back and said good night and went inside. And she stood in the hallway with her back against the door and her hand still warm where it had touched him, and she told herself, firmly and without particular success, to be sensible. The weeks that followed were the most honest courting she had ever experienced, not the stylized performance of a courtship that kept everything at arm's length, but something real and textured, and built out of actual time spent together. He came on Sundays and some evenings after his work at the Dawson place. He helped when she needed help and went home when she didn't, understanding the difference in a way that most people didn't, because she had a very specific way of needing help that was different from most people's. She didn't need someone to solve things for her. She needed, occasionally, an additional pair of hands on a problem that genuinely required more than two. He provided that without inflation or drama. They talked. That was the thing she hadn't expected, the talking. They talked about Kansas and Missouri, about cattle and grass and weather. They talked about books they had both read and had different opinions about, and the arguments about the books were some of the best conversations she had ever had, conducted with the focused intensity of two people who both cared about the subject. They talked about the larger world, which was in motion in complicated ways in 1882. The Dawes Act wasn't yet law, but the policy movements that would lead to it were already underway, and she and Louis both watched the treatment of the indigenous nations with a discomfort that neither of them articulated easily, but that was there when certain subjects came up. The recognition that the land they stood on had a history that preceded them, and that the way it had been acquired was not something that sat entirely cleanly with a person who valued fairness. Louis had ridden alongside Comanche traders in his early years on the trail, and he had learned enough of the interactions to have a more specific understanding than most. Jennie had listened to Robert Wells talk about the Indian Territory with a complexity she had appreciated. They were both people who, by the standards of their time, held views that were somewhat outside the norm, not radical, not organized, but honest in a personal way. They talked about it carefully, the way you talk about something that matters but that you are not yet certain how to talk about properly. They talked about Cleo too, one evening when something in town had reminded them of the particular difficulties of his position. The war had been over for 17 years, but the reconstruction of the social order had not gone as hoped, and the freedoms that had been legally granted were being systematically undermined across the South in ways that were beginning to spread. Kansas was better. Kansas had its own particular injustices, but the legal landscape was less actively hostile, and Cleo had built a life in Caldwell County that had a kind of stability. though that stability required constant careful management of how he moved through spaces that still regarded him with a variety of attitudes ranging from hostility to grudging acceptance. "He's one of the best men I've met," Louis said one evening, and he said it simply, without the tone of discovered discovery that some people used when they had only recently decided to see someone clearly. "I know it," Jennie said. "He's kept this place from falling apart more times than I can count. I'd be lost without him." She paused. "He's also his own man completely. He doesn't need me saying that to be true." "No," Louis agreed. "He doesn't." November arrived, and with it the cold that came off the plains like something with a personal grudge. Jennie's cattle had shelter now, the rebuilt barn standing solid against the first hard winds, and she felt a satisfaction each morning when she looked at it that had multiple sources, the completion of the practical problem, and the way the completing of it had come about, and what it had led to. She was gathering firewood on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of November when she found the problem with the east well. The well had been sinking slowly for months. She had known it, but the rate had accelerated, and when she dropped the bucket that afternoon, it came up barely a third full with water that had a sandy color that was not encouraging. She stood there with the bucket in her hands and did the calculations, which were not reassuring. A well that was failing in November with winter coming was a serious problem. She would need to either dig deeper or find an alternative water source, and neither was a trivial undertaking. She told Cleo. He looked at the bucket and the water in it and confirmed her assessment without drama, which she appreciated. She did not tell Louis. She did not tell Louis because the barn had been one thing, that had been structural emergency, and she had permitted it because she had no choice, and because the cattle's shelter was not about her pride but about the animals. But the well was something she could manage if she made the right decisions and executed them correctly. She could arrange for someone from town to come and assess the well depth. She could divert water from the creek through a pipe system for the winter. She could solve this. She spent 3 days working on the diversion plan, which involved pipe sections she found at the back of Robert's tool store, some of which were serviceable and some of which were not, and a calculation of the slope gradient between the creek and the barn that required more trigonometry than she'd thought she would need in her life. She worked on it in the mornings before Louis came for his Sunday visit, which was now an established part of the week's structure, and she had the workings of a plan by Friday. Louis noticed on Sunday that she was managing something she wasn't talking about. He noticed because he had become very good at reading her, the slight tension around her eyes, the way she answered questions a fraction faster than usual, as if she were managing bandwidth. He did not ask directly, because he had learned enough about her to know that a direct question about something she wasn't ready to share would result in a denial that would make the eventual conversation more difficult. Instead, after supper, he asked if she would show him around the east side of the property. He said he had been curious about the creek access. She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said, with a wariness that acknowledged she knew what he was doing even if she was going along with it. They walked out in the dark with a lantern, and he saw the well within about 4 minutes. He stopped and looked at the bucket and the low water line without saying anything, and she stood beside him with her arms crossed and watched him look at it. "How long?" he said. "A few months of decline. It's gotten worse the last 2 weeks. "What's your plan?" she told him. He listened to all of it, and then he crouched down and looked at the well casing and the surrounding soil, and he asked a few questions about the creek water and the pipe sections, and then he stood up and said, "The pipe plan will work, but you need more fall in the line. The gradient from the creek to the barn is about 2 feet in the stretch you're describing, and that's borderline. You need 3 to 4 for reliable flow in cold weather. But if you angle the intake point 30 yards upstream where the bank rises, you get it." She had not walked 30 yards upstream. She had calculated from the obvious access point. She said nothing for a moment. "You already had most of it right," he said, and there was nothing in his voice except the practical observation. No smugness, no inflation, just the addition of one piece to a puzzle that was mostly solved already. "I didn't ask," she said. "I know you didn't." They stood there in the lantern light next to the failing well, and she looked at him, and something shifted finally, like a lock turning over in a mechanism that has been resisting for a while, and then simply, without drama, opens. "Louis," she said, and the name in her mouth had a different weight than it had before. He turned to look at her fully. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it, from the beginning." His expression in the lantern light was very quiet. "Jennie, I'm not good at this." "At which part?" "Letting anyone in, trusting that it won't cost me something I can't afford." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What did it cost you the last time you trusted someone?" She thought about Robert. Not about his death, but about the marriage, the actual living arrangement of it, the daily practice of being in life with another person. "It didn't cost me anything," she said honestly. "He was a good man, and he loved me well, and I loved him back. When he died, I thought I was afraid of losing that kind of loss again. I think what I was really afraid of was needing someone and having them not be able to bear the need." Louis looked at her steadily. "I can bear it," he said, "the need. You don't know what it is yet. I know some of it. I've watched you for 3 months, and I know what you need and what you don't need, and the difference matters. You don't need someone to solve things for you. You need someone to be there when the solution requires more than 2 hands." He paused. "I'm a very good pair of additional hands." She laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and it surprised her into warmth. He smiled at the sound of it, and she thought that he would spend some time looking for that laugh again, that it was the kind of thing a person wanted to locate a second time and then a third. She stepped toward him and he held still, and she put her hand against his jaw, the way she had put it against his chest that first night on the porch, except this time she did not step back. He put his hand over hers. "I love you," she said, because it was true and because she was not, when things came down to it, a woman who softened the truth for comfort's sake. He said, "I have loved you since you told me on that sidewalk that it was not my concern." And she heard the precision of it, the particular moment he named, and she understood that it was the exact truth, that it had been that moment of controlled composure and absolute refusal to fall apart that had done it, that he had seen something in her that he had not known he was looking for. He kissed her then, in the cold November night beside the failing well with the lantern swinging slightly in the wind, and it was thorough and unhurried and entirely genuine. And she kissed him back with everything she had held carefully in check for 3 months, and the night was very quiet around them except for the wind in the grass. They fixed the well the following week, adjusting the creek intake as he had suggested, and the diversion pipe ran clean and strong through the cold December weather. Jennie paid back the lumber debt in December when she sold a portion of her winter cattle at the stockyard for a price better than she had hoped, and she pressed the money into Louis's hand with a satisfaction so intense it was almost physical. He folded it into his coat without counting it, because he had trusted her word from the beginning and saw no reason to change that now. He was still working for the Dawson outfit, and there were weeks when his schedule there was heavy and he came less often, and she managed those weeks with the self-sufficiency that was her nature. And when he came back, there was nothing requiring apology or explanation, because they had both understood from the beginning what kind of arrangement suited them. A love story does not always look like total possession. Sometimes it looks like 2 people who are whole on their own and choose, freely and with full knowledge of the cost, to be better together. He proposed in January, on a Sunday afternoon when the snow had come down for 2 days, and then stopped and left the land white and still and impossibly beautiful. The kind of beauty Kansas produced occasionally as if to explain why people stayed. They were sitting on the porch, which was ridiculous in January, but they had wool blankets and he had brought a flask of decent whiskey, and she was looking out at the snow-covered pasture and the rebuilt barn standing solid in the white landscape, and he said, "Marry me," and she said, "You're not even going to make a ceremony of it. You don't like ceremony." "That's true," she said. She thought for a moment. "Yes." "Yes, to which part?" "Yes, to marrying you. "Which you knew I'd say, which is why you didn't make a ceremony of it." He handed her the flask. "I wasn't entirely sure." "Yes, you were." He didn't deny it. She drank the whiskey and handed it back, and they sat in the cold looking at the snow, and she felt the particular happiness that comes from knowing precisely where you are and being glad of it. They were married in March of 1883, in the Caldwell church on a morning when the weather had come good for the first time after a long winter, with a clear sky the color of a blue jay and a warmth in the sun that felt like a promise. Cleo wore his good shirt and stood near the front with an expression of deep private satisfaction. Tamaz had decorated the church porch with the first spring wildflowers in a gesture that was so unexpectedly thoughtful that Jennie felt her composure threaten for a moment, and then recovered it. The Reverend Hollis, who had known Jennie since Robert's funeral, looked over his spectacles at her with something close to relief, as if he had been waiting to see her properly happy again. Louis's friend from the Dawson outfit, a man named Fletcher who had a booming voice and an enormous sense of occasion, served as witness along with Margaret Howell, who was beside herself with importance and kept her commentary mostly internal for the duration of the ceremony. Louis held her hand through the vows and said his own with a steadiness that was simply him. No performance, no elevated tone for the occasion, just the same quiet certainty with which he approached every other true thing. She said hers back with the same directness, and the Reverend Hollis pronounced them married, and Louis kissed her and Fletcher made a noise of celebration that startled the horses outside, and Jennie laughed her real laugh again, the sudden unguarded one, and Louis's hand was warm at the small of her back, and everything was exactly what it was. There was a discussion, before the wedding, about where they would live. Louis gave up his bunkhouse room at the Dawson place without reluctance, and they agreed that the Wells Ranch was the place they would build from. He kept working with Dawson for the income during the months when ranch revenue was thin, and she ran the cattle operation as she always had, except now with better finances and another pair of hands that had proven themselves reliable. They were equals in it, in every practical and legal sense, which was something she had insisted upon, and which he had agreed to so readily, it removed any anxiety she had about the conversation. She talked to a lawyer in Wichita about the property title, and it was adjusted to reflect joint ownership with specific provisions that protected her original holding, and when she came home with the paperwork Louis signed where she showed him to sign and said, "Good," and that was that. The first spring and summer of their marriage was full. They expanded the cattle herd by 12 head, a careful investment they had discussed thoroughly and agreed on with the kind of practical consensus that was becoming the language of their partnership. Cleo took on a supervisory role that acknowledged the scope of his contribution more formally, with wages to match. Tamaz, who was 18 now and clearly not going to remain a boy much longer, asked in a serious way whether there would be continued work for him, and Jennie assured him there would be, and that she intended to teach him more of the management side of things, which lit his face with a surprised pleasure. In the evenings, after the work was done, she and Louis sat together in the house and talked or read or sat in comfortable silence that had a different quality from the silence of solitude. She had not expected to find this. The discovery that someone else's presence in a familiar space could make the space larger rather than smaller. She had been afraid, somewhere beneath the determination and the practicality, that living with another person again would reduce her somehow, that the adjustments and accommodations required would chip away at the self she had built with such difficulty. Instead, she found that she was more fully herself than she had been before, because there was someone in the house who knew who she was and was not interested in her being otherwise. He was reading one evening in late summer when she came and sat beside him on the settee close enough that their shoulders touched, and he put the book down and looked at her, and she said, "I think I'm expecting." He was still for a moment, and then something in his face changed in the way faces change when information arrives that reshapes the entire landscape. "Are you certain?" "Fairly certain. I'll be more certain in another few weeks." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, which was something she had finally stopped having to remind herself was permitted. They sat like that for a while in the summer evening with the light going amber through the window and the sound of the land outside, and she felt the weight and the reality of it settling into her like the roots of something. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "A little." "So am I," he said. "That seems right." She was more certain in 3 weeks. By October she was undeniably showing, and the town of Caldwell took this information in with the varied response that Caldwell always had to information about the Whitakers, which ranged from warm, genuine happiness from their actual friends to the carefully pleasant acknowledgement of the people who had never quite decided what to make of Jennie Wells and were still working on it. Cleo, when she told him, became briefly and absolutely speechless, which was so unlike him that she worried for a moment she'd given him a fright. Then he collected himself and said, "Robert would have been pleased," and she felt the truth of that in her chest without it hurting, which was something she had not been sure was possible. The winter was hard but manageable. She modified her work as her condition required and did not find the modifications easy but made them, because the modifications were in service of something larger than her usual preferences. Louis was attentive without being smothering, which she had been anxious about, having expected the smothering, but he seemed to understand the difference between genuine care and the kind of anxious, hovering that would have made her feel managed rather than loved. The boy was born in late March of 1884, on a cold evening with the wind making the windows rattle and a fire in the stove, and a midwife named Mrs. Hadlow, who had delivered half the children in Caldwell County. He was healthy and large, and had a set of opinions about the world that he expressed immediately and with volume. Louis held him afterward with the concentrated wonder of a man encountering something completely beyond his prior experience, and Jennie watched him from the bed, exhausted and hollow and flooded with something that had no single word, and thought that she was looking at the two most important things in her life occupying the same space. They named him Robert James Whitaker, Robert for the man who had built the ranch that was now their foundation, James for Louis's father. Cleo held the baby on the second day and was very quiet for a long time and then said, "He's got your eyes, Miss Jennie," and she said, "I think he does." And that was as close as either of them came to talking about everything that had been lost and built and continued. Tomás, who had grown by this point into a young man of evident capability and seriousness, took one look at the baby through the doorway of the bedroom and said he was going to need to work faster now that there would be a third generation to manage the ranch for, and Jennie told him he was not wrong. Robert James grew into his name and into the ranch by degrees. He was a serious baby who became a curious toddler, pulling himself upright against the fence posts in the yard, and standing in the sunlight looking at the cattle with an expression of grave interest that made Cleo chuckle every time. Louis taught him the names of the horses as soon as he could form words, and Robert could say the name of every animal on the property before he could properly run, which delighted Louis in a way that was entirely unguarded and open. In the spring of 1885, Jennie found she was expecting again. This time the news arrived with less anxiety, the machinery of their life together by now well established enough to absorb the additional change without dislocation. Louis held her hand when she told him and said, "Good," in a tone that meant several things at once, and she leaned her forehead against his shoulder for a moment in the way she had come to do, the brief and real contact that required no explanation. The second child was a girl. She arrived in November of 1885, smaller and more vehement than her brother, with a head of dark hair that came from Louis and a temperament that appeared to come from Jennie, and was going to be a force of considerable nature when it fully developed. They named her Clara Mee Whitaker, for Jennie's grandmother on her mother's side, and for no particular reason beyond the sound of it. Robert, who was 18 months old and had been an only child long enough to have views about the matter, considered his sister for a long moment when he was first shown her. and then apparently decided she was acceptable, because he reached out one careful finger and touched her hand with an expression of solemn investigation. And Clara me grabbed the finger with the automatic grip of a newborn, and Robert's face transformed into something so purely delighted that everyone in the room laughed. The following years laid themselves down in the way that good years do, not without difficulty, because difficulty was the constant weather of a working ranch in the 1880s in Kansas, but with a texture of accumulated rightness that made the difficulty meaningful rather than merely hard. There were bad cattle prices in 1886 and a drought summer that required careful water management and careful conversations about what to sell and what to hold. There was a fire in the north pasture from a lightning strike that took them 3 days to fully control and left a blackened section that the grass came back on by the following spring. There were the ongoing movements and pressures of the larger world, the increasing railroad influence on cattle prices, the tightening of the range as more homesteaders moved in and fences went up. They navigated all of it together, which was not always comfortable. They argued, sometimes with real heat, about decisions and priorities and approaches, and these arguments were honest and occasionally loud and always arrived at resolution, because they were both people who cared more about getting things right than about being the one who was right. She won some. He won some. On the things that mattered most, they found the position between them that neither of them could have reached alone. Tomas, by 1887, had become something between a full partner in the operation and a member of the family, the distinction having blurred so gradually that no one could point to when it had happened. He was 21, with a serious young man's face and hands that could fix anything mechanical on the property, and he was beginning to talk about having some land of his own one day. Jennie and Louis had a conversation about this, and then they had a conversation with Tomas, and the outcome of that conversation was a formal arrangement in which Tomas would work the Louis Whitaker land and receive a portion of the revenue toward a purchase price for the adjacent 40 acres that had come available when the Hennessy family moved back east. It was not a simple arrangement legally, but they found a Wichita lawyer who could make it work, and the paperwork was signed in the spring of 1888, and Tomas stood in the lawyer's office with his hands in his pockets, and his face the most completely unguarded Jennie had ever seen it. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "You earned it," Jennie said. "We don't give away things people haven't earned." Cleo turned 60 in 1888, a fact that arrived with the additional weight of his having lived 6 decades through circumstances that had bent and tried to break anyone with less fundamental resilience. They celebrated his birthday in the kitchen of the main house with a cake Jennie had made from a recipe that required more effort than most baked goods, and Louis found a bottle of decent bourbon from somewhere, and they sat around the table, all of them, and Cleo was quiet in the way of someone receiving something they are not entirely sure they deserve, and are not going to argue about because the moment is too good to interfere with. "To 60, Louis said, raising a glass. "To the next 60, Cleo said, with a smile that was 60 years of things happening to you and not finishing you off, and that was better than any speech. Robert was 4 years old and Clara me was 2, and they were both at the table being managed by the fact of each other's existence, Robert attempting to prevent Clara from getting into his portion of the cake, with the resigned authority of an older sibling who has already learned that authority is mostly theoretical. It was loud and warm and real, and Louis caught Jennie's eye across the table, and she felt the look land in the center of her chest with that particular accuracy he had developed for finding her attention in any room. She loved him. She had loved him for years by now with a full-bodied, clear-eyed love that had been tested enough to know its own dimensions, and had not found a limit. She loved the way he worked, and the way he read, and the way he held the children, and the way he argued with her, and the way he apologized when he was wrong, and the way he danced, still, at the social events they attended, which she had come back to with the regularity that partnership made possible. She loved that he was proud without needing to perform it, that his confidence in himself was a quiet structural thing rather than a presentation. She thought sometimes about the morning she had stood on the sidewalk outside Hartley's General Supply and decided she did not need anyone, and how the most important thing that had ever happened to her had walked across the street toward that exact determination. She thought about how she had been right that she didn't need him, technically and practically, and in every self-sufficient sense. She had been fully capable of managing her life without Louis Whitaker. The question that the years had answered was not whether she needed him, but what it meant to choose someone, freely and completely, and with full knowledge, and to have that choice returned in exactly the same measure. In the spring of 1889, when the land was greening again, and Robert was 5 and beginning to develop an opinion about horses that was going to require some management, Louis came in from the east pasture one evening with mud on his boots and his hat pushed back on his head, and a particular look on his face that meant he had been thinking about something for a while. She was at the table with the ranch ledger, and she looked up and waited. "I want to put an offer in on the Beaumont land," he said. "The north section, the 80 acres coming up for sale." She set down her pencil. They had talked about expansion before in the abstract, the way you talk about things you want when you're not yet ready to want them. The Beaumont land was specific, and the Beaumont land was expensive. "Sit down," she said. "Let's look at the figures." They sat and looked at the figures together for 2 hours, the way they made every significant decision, with all the information available and both of them willing to say what they actually thought and listen to what the other actually said. By the end of the 2 hours, they had a position and a number they could offer, and a plan for how to manage the purchase price over 3 years without endangering the existing operation. He put his hand over hers on the ledger page. "Is this what you want?" he asked, because he always asked that, the specific wanting of her specifically, not just the practical wisdom of the decision. "It's what we want," she said, "which is more interesting." The offer went in, and after a negotiation that took most of April, the 80 acres were theirs by the 1st of May. They walked the new land on a warm afternoon with the children, Robert running ahead in the grass, with the energy of a 5-year-old who had not yet understood that energy has a natural ceiling, and Clara Mee on Louis's shoulders with her small hands gripping his hair, watching the world from the height of her father's shoulders with an expression of serene authority. Jennie walked beside him through the new grass, and the land stretched out ahead of them, green and wide and full of the specific open promise of the plains, and she thought about 40 acres and a collapsing barn and a morning on a sidewalk and a man who had walked across a street because he had noticed something he could not notice. "You're thinking about something," Louis said. He could always tell. "I'm thinking about how things start," she said. He looked over at her. Clara Mee tugged at his hair with cheerful violence, and he winced slightly and reached up to reposition her grip without breaking the eye contact with Jennie. "How do they start?" he said. "With the one thing you don't know you need," she said, "and the other person refusing to accept that you don't know it." He reached out and took her hand as they walked, and Robert circled back to grab her other hand and swing from it with his full 4-foot weight, and she steadied herself and laughed, and Louis laughed too, and Clara Mee announced something from her perch with the full confidence of a 2-year-old who has never had reason to doubt that the world would respond, and the afternoon went long and golden around them. In the summer of 1889, Cleo's health began to give some concerns. Nothing catastrophic, but a slowness in the mornings that had not been there before, a cough that came with the cold nights and stayed longer than it should. He was not a man who talked about his health, and the conversation about it required a delicacy that Jennie approached carefully, because she would not patronize him, and she would not make it smaller than it was. She sat with him one evening on the bunkhouse step, the way she had sat with him many times over the years, in the particular comfortable way of people who have known each other long enough to have no performance left. "I want you to see Dr. Prescott," she said. "I'm fine," he said. "Cleo." He was quiet for a while. I'm 61 years old. Some of what I'm feeling is 61 years. I know it is. That doesn't mean there isn't also something else worth looking at. He looked out at the yard, the barn standing solid in the evening light, the horses in the paddock, the general ordered landscape of a working ranch. This place looks different than when Robert built it, he said. It is different. Better different, he said. He paused. Robert would have built it the same given the means. He just didn't have the time. No, she said. He didn't. Another pause. I'll see Prescott. She let out a breath. Thank you, doctor. Prescott found some bronchial thickening that he prescribed rest and warm air for, which were not surprising diagnoses, and he suggested that Cleo reduce his heaviest physical work through the cold months. Jennie adjusted Cleo's responsibilities accordingly, which required its own negotiation, but which ended in an arrangement that gave him a managerial role that suited his actual expertise and protected his health without reducing his place in the operation. Tomás absorbed the additional physical work without complaint, because his own land adjacent was progressing well, and he understood the economy of the whole, and because he was a young man with the kind of character that did not require gratitude for doing what was right. The autumn of 1889 passed into winter and winter into the spring of 1890, and the ranch entered its 8th year since Jennie had stood in the mud looking at the collapsed barn roof with her fists at her sides. The years had been layered onto it like sediment, each season's difficulty and resolution settling into the foundation of the thing they had built, making it deeper and more stable. Robert was 6 and had developed, as Jennie had anticipated, a relationship with horses that was going to define his life in some important way. Louis had started teaching him in earnest, the real teaching, the kind that came from working alongside rather than instructing from a distance, and Robert absorbed it with the same quiet competence that was Louis's own signature. He was a thoughtful child who did not talk constantly but who watched everything, and Jennie recognized in him the watcher's quality she recognized in Louis, the eyes that notice things. Clara Mee was 4 and a confirmed force of nature. She was talkative where Robert was quiet, immediate where he was patient, and she had inherited Jennie's particular brand of determination at such an early age that it was already evident she was going to require a great deal of world to hold her. Louis dealt with her with a patient amusement that was one of Jennie's favorite things to watch, the way he matched her energy without being swept away by it, the way he listened to her elaborate and frequently illogical arguments with serious attention before responding. "She argues like you," he told Jennie one evening. "She argues better than me," Jennie said. "She's got no uncertainty about it. She'll learn the uncertainty. For now it's magnificent." He was not wrong. It was magnificent. There was a moment in the fall of 1890 that Jennie would return to in memory many times in the years that followed. It was an ordinary evening, mid-September, with the light going low and golden over the expanded ranch, the 80 new acres visible from the kitchen window now that Louis had taken down the old Beaumont fence that had marked the property line. They had eaten supper and the children were in bed, and she and Louis were on the porch in the chairs they had replaced the old ones with in the spring, side by side in the cooling evening. He was reading. She was working through the monthly ledger. The lamp between them cast a warm circle of light, and outside its edge the darkness had settled in completely and the stars were out in the way that Kansas stars came out when the air was clear, which was staggering in its totality. She put down the ledger at some point and simply sat, and he looked over and saw her sitting and put the book down too, and they sat in the quiet together for a while. "Louis," she said, "Jennie, I want you to know something." He waited. "When you came across that street," she said, "when you knocked on my door with that lumber, I hated it. I genuinely hated it. I know you did. And I need you to know that it was the best thing that ever happened to me. Not because I needed the help, because of who you were when you gave it." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see the weight of it landing in him, settling in that place where the true things settle. "You never stopped being yourself," he said, "through any of it. You were exactly who you were from the first day, and it never changed to accommodate me, and that is the most extraordinary thing about it. I don't want a version of you that's accommodated. I want you." She reached over and took his hand in the dark. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said back, in the same plain and complete way, as if the sentence required no decoration. They sat like that for a long time, with the stars overhead and the ranch around them, the rebuilt barn and the new acres and the children sleeping inside and Cleo in the bunkhouse and Tomas in his own place on his own land next door. And all of the things they had built and solved and decided and argued about and come through together, making up the substance of their life, which was not a perfect life and had never claimed to be, but was full and real and deeply, specifically theirs. In the years that followed, the ranch continued to grow and to face the challenges that the changing West presented. The cattle business shifted as the trail drives wound down, and the railroad became the primary means of transport, and they adapted as they had always adapted, which was with clear eyes and a willingness to do the work of changing when changing was what survival required. The open range was closing, fenced in by progress and population, and the Whitaker operation evolved with it, becoming a more focused and deliberate enterprise than the expansive trail-based economy of the earlier decades. Robert, at 10, was already a genuine partner in the horsework, not a child given tasks but a boy who understood what he was doing and could be trusted with it, and Louis worked alongside him with a satisfaction that had a particular quality, the satisfaction of passing something forward, of watching capability develop from the ground up in someone who was also your son. Clara Mee, at 8, had decided she was going to learn everything, and she pursued this ambition with a comprehensive approach that kept everyone in the household on their toes. She learned to ride earlier and better than most children. She persuaded Jennie to teach her figures and letters with an intensity that required real instructional effort, and she had appointed herself the unofficial judge of all disputes between herself and Robert, a role he disputed with the dry patience of an older brother, who had learned that disputing it was mostly theoretical. Jennie watched her daughter and thought about the world that Clara Mee would grow into, which would be different from the world she had navigated, and she hoped the differences would be improvements, and she suspected some of them would be, and some of them would not, and she determined to make sure her daughter had every possible tool for navigating whatever the world turned out to be, which was the most a mother could do with any accuracy. Louis, at 37, had not lost the quality she had loved in him from the beginning, the open attentiveness, the quiet competence, the absence of performance. He was deeper than he had been, worn in rather than worn down, the way good leather becomes more itself with years of use. He had gray in his hair now at the temples, which she told him looked distinguished, and which he dismissed with genuine indifference because he did not think about his appearance much. She thought about it enough for both of them, which was a fact she would not have volunteered but which was true. The decade turned into the 1890s, and Kansas entered a period of drought and economic depression that tested everyone in the county. Crop failures and falling cattle prices created the kind of hardship that broke some operations entirely and required the others to find reserves they hadn't known they had. The Whitaker Ranch survived, not comfortably, but with the solvency that came from careful management over years of better times. They reduced the herd, kept the best animals, tightened everything that could be tightened, and came through the worst of it in 1893 with the land intact and the operation reduced but not broken. During those hardest years, they helped their neighbors when they could in the same way that Louis had once helped Jennie, practically and without fanfare, without requiring that the help be acknowledged in any particular way. The philosophy that had been the foundation of their own beginning became the principle of how they moved through their community, and it was not a principle anyone had articulated. It was simply the way they were. By 1895, Jennie was 40 years old and Louis was 41, and they had been married 12 years, and Robert was 11 and Clara Mee was 9, and Cleo was 67, and had settled into an elder's role on the ranch that was mostly advisory now, and carried the weight of everything he had seen and built and survived. Tomaz's land adjacent had expanded modestly, and he had, to the quiet delight of everyone, married a young woman from Caldwell named Rosa who was capable and warm, and had immediately understood what the Whitaker operation was about, and had fit into the extended family of it with a naturalness that felt predestined. Rosa brought a baby in 1895, a boy they named Miguel, and Robert and Clara took their responsibilities as honorary older children with a seriousness that was amusing and touching in equal measure. On a morning in late summer of 1895, Jennie was standing on the porch of the main house with her coffee in the early light, looking out at the land. The new acres were fully integrated now, indistinguishable from the original 40, and the whole of it stretched out in the morning light with the specific beauty of land that has been cared for and worked and loved, which is a different beauty from wild land but not a lesser one. She heard Louis come out of the house behind her and felt the warmth of him when he stopped beside her, and he had his own coffee, and he stood there with her looking at the same thing she was looking at. "What are you thinking?" he said. She thought about what she was thinking, which was numerous things at once, the way her thoughts always were when she stood still long enough to let them surface. "I'm thinking that the morning I stood in the mud looking at the barn, I told myself I didn't need anyone," she said. "And I'm thinking that I was right and wrong at the same time, which is the most interesting kind of being wrong." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "How so?" "Right because I could have managed. I would have found a way. I always find a way." She paused. "Wrong because managing and living are different things, and I didn't know that then, or I knew it but I didn't know what to do with knowing it." He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side in the easy way of 12 years of choosing to lean, and the morning went on around them, the horses moving in the paddock, a rooster from Tomaz's place making its announcement, the faint sound of one of the children inside, the whole warm, ordinary machinery of their life running. "We should wake the children," she said. "There's work today." "There's always work today," he said. "That's the thing about work. It keeps showing up." "Like you did," she said. He kissed the side of her head, which was something he had done 10,000 times and which still landed with the same warmth it had the first time, which was one of the things she had not known to expect from a long love, that it did not diminish with repetition but deepened, that the accumulation of shared time made each present moment more layered and not less. "Like I did," he agreed. She went inside to start the morning, and he followed her, and the day opened up ahead of them with all its work and noise and ordinariness. The children coming downstairs with their morning complaints and questions, the breakfast things to be managed, the day's tasks to be organized, the land outside waiting for everything they would bring to it. And the Wells Whitaker Ranch, sitting on its 120 acres of Kansas grassland, with the rebuilt barn standing solid against the morning sky, and the new acres green to the east, and the year 1895 moving through its summer toward a fall that would be followed by another year and another year after that, full of all the things that a life built together and maintained with care and honesty could hold, continued on in the way that good things continue, not without difficulty, and not without change, but with the deep structural soundness of something that has been built right and built from the truest possible materials. The morning Jennie Wells's barn roof caved in and she stood in the mud with her fists clenched and told herself she did not need a single soul. She had been telling the fullest possible truth. And the morning Louis Whitaker crossed that street and told her he would be by in the morning with tools, he had been telling the same kind of truth back, the kind that is not about what anyone needs, but about what a person cannot, in the end, not do. She had been too proud to ask for help. He had been too stubborn not to give it anyway. And from that particular collision of two true and opposite things, everything else had followed. The barn and the well and the Sunday suppers and the church social, and the porch in November, and the proposal in January snow, and the March wedding and Robert James and Clara and Cleo at 60 and Tomaz on his own land. and the 80 acres in May and 12 years of work and argument and laughter, and the specific daily choosing of each other that is what love actually is when you look at it close enough. Not the beginning of it, not the dramatic moments, but the choosing, over and over, in the ordinary light of ordinary mornings to stay.